Everybody, can you guys hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you everybody for coming. This talk is Startup DNA. And what the talk's really about is a bit of a formula, a bit of a set of traits that I found that just about every successful startup that I've seen seems to share. And so this is, hopefully if you're building a startup or thinking about it, these are going to be useful for you to build your own successful company. A lot of these lessons come from Silicon Valley, but I think they work just about everywhere. And the reason you should care about this is the reality is that most startups fail. Depending how you count, depending what you mean by failure and what you mean by startup, about 3 out of 4 of them are going to fail. And yet a very, very small number will have these wild, wild successes. And the question is why? Why do some companies succeed while the others fail? I'm certainly not the first person to ask. Back in the day, Leo Tolstoy told us this. This is my own personal translation. But just about every single startup that's successful seems to do a few things more or less the same way, whereas failures are all over the place. So that's what this talk is about. It's about a few traits that I think are good to emulate if you want to build a successful company. I'm Evgeny Brickman. I also go by the nickname Jim, which is slightly easier to pronounce for most people. And I'm the co-founder of a company called Gruntwork. We are a small startup. I'm trying to apply those traits to this startup. And we help companies build their infrastructure and their DevOps practices. Previous lives, worked at a few places, including a couple of very successful startups, LinkedIn and TripAdvisor. I also spent a lot of time around many other startups and many other early employees from companies like Google, Facebook, and Twitter, and Stripe, and Pinterest, and Quora, and you name a startup, it's probably on the list. And based on all that stuff that I learned, I wrote a book called Hello Startup, where it's essentially the long version of the talk. So this talk is the TLDR of the book. So this is what we're going to talk about. The first one is probably the single most important thing I'm going to say, so I'll front load the talk. And the idea is to make excellent mistakes. This is really the core of what I think makes startup success possible. If you don't do this, all the other stuff doesn't really matter. So what am I talking about? If you look at any of these successful startups, any company that you admire, any company that is popular and had a wild IPO or acquisition or whatever else, what you'll find is that behind them, they've left a long, long trail of failure. Tons and tons of things that did not work out, tons of failed projects. And there's no exceptions. There's not a single successful company that hasn't had a ton of failure behind it. So some examples. Occasionally companies launch some sort of a project and that project doesn't work out. So I know from personal experience at LinkedIn had a bunch of failures. LinkedIn Answers didn't really go anywhere. I don't know if you guys even knew, LinkedIn used to have an events product. That never took off. There was integration with GitHub and Twitter. A company they bought to do this thing called Lead Accelerator, none of those worked out. I also know from personal experience there were dozens of things that never really saw the light of day. Projects that were started internally and either fizzled out too early or hit an internal launch, or maybe 1% of users somewhere saw them and they just never took off. Tons and tons of failures. LinkedIn's not alone. Facebook, another really successful, popular company, has had tons of really high-profile failures. Beacon, Places, Deals, Credits. Google has tons of famous failures, if you want to call them that. Google Wave and Google Buzz and Google Labs and Health. All of these have been shut down. Occasionally, a company has their core idea doesn't work. And so they have to pivot. They have to change the entire company. And there's some famous examples of that. So there's Flickr, which when they launched was actually a massively multiplayer online game called Game Never Ending. The game wasn't that successful, it wasn't that popular, but the people that were using it spent a lot of time sharing photos. So the folks at Flickr thought, well, that seems like a good idea. They pivoted the entire company to focus on photo sharing, and then in 2005, they were acquired by Yahoo. Instagram, similar story. Started out as something called Bourbon, which was a location-based social network. Again, not super popular or successful, but they noticed that the people that used it really liked the photo sharing. And in 2012, Instagram, after pivoting to focus on photo sharing, was acquired by Facebook for $1 billion. By the way, the formula is not just to build photo sharing. That's just a weird coincidence. Twitter, I don't know how many people know this. Twitter started as a podcasting site called Audio. And that wasn't working well at all, and so they ended up having a hack day or hackathon competition, and one of the ideas that came out of that was microblogging. And even then, it didn't really quite work, right? Because it was all based on text messages, And that's why there's the 140 character limit. That's the limit on text messaging. So they pivoted again and again, and eventually they got something that was pretty successful. They had an IPO in 2013. Starting to struggle a little bit again, so it's not out of the question they're going to have to pivot again. Occasionally, the core idea of a company fails and the whole company goes with it. So as an example, Reid Hoffman, who's the co-founder of LinkedIn, his first startup was actually called SocialNet. How many of you guys have heard of SocialNet? Yeah, exactly. It was a dating site, a social network for dating. It was way ahead of its time. This was like, I think, late 90s. It didn't stop him. Reid went on to become the CEO of PayPal, did extremely well there, then became the co-founder of LinkedIn. So that was actually his second try at this social networking space. Not dating, but still social networking. And he has this wonderful quote where he basically says that startups are like jumping off a cliff and building a plane on the way down. And I think that's pretty important to keep in mind. Richard Branson is notorious for failed companies. He's had dozens of companies that have failed. Virgin Clothes, Virgin Cola, Virgin Vision, vodka, et cetera. All of these failed. But he's had hundreds of companies that have succeeded under the Virgin brand. Hundreds. And I think the best way to think about this, I've been calling it failure, but it's not failure. That's not quite the right term. Thomas Edison captured this really well. So Thomas Edison, most people think of him as the inventor of the light bulb, but he actually invented a commercially viable filament. And to come up with a filament that actually worked, he tried 10,000 different experiments. He just kept trying things over and over and over and just relentless until he found something that finally worked. And reporters would ask him, well, how do you feel about your first 1,000 failures, your first 5,000 failures? And his answer was, I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. And that's kind of the core message here. These aren't failures. The goal isn't failure, right? A lot of people talk about failure, but I think that's the wrong focus. The focus is that these are experiments. What Thomas Edison is doing is actually what Richard Branson is doing, is actually what Reid Hoffman was doing. The way to think about a startup, the way to think about products, is as experiments. And you can't really fail an experiment. You can only learn. You either disprove your hypothesis or you add support for it. You can't really fail. You can only learn. So that's the healthy way to think about startups. That's the way that every successful company I've seen thinks about what they do. They think of it as a series of experiments that they're trying, and maybe the experiment will go one way, maybe it won't. Sometimes when the experiment doesn't go the way you want, that's actually where the most interesting results come out. And learning is really what it's about. Eric Ries wrote a really famous book called The Lean Startup, and what he basically says is the way you measure progress as a startup is not revenue or product or the number of users, it's learning. It's how much have you learned? Have you learned how to build a product? Have you learned how to sell that product? Have you learned how to build a team? Those are the things that matter for a startup, and they're all done through experiments. Now, what happens if you don't do it right is this. You get this lovely image. CB Insights did a really interesting study. They looked at the postmortems for over 100 startups, and they looked at why those startups failed. And they found that the number one reason, the number one cause for the majority of those startups, for almost half of them, was no market need. Now think about that. These are companies that spent months, years, who knows how much money building something that nobody wanted. I think that's actually a little tragic. I think if I'd poured months and years into something nobody wanted, that'd be very depressing. But it's actually a very important thing because it turns out that the biggest risk to most startups is not building things the wrong way, it's building the wrong thing. If you don't build the right thing, it doesn't matter how well you do it, you're not going to succeed. And so how do you find out that what you're building is the right thing? And the only way to do it is through experiments. We sort of paint this picture of startup founders as these all-knowing, incredible human beings that can just divine the future, but that's not how it works. They have an idea sometimes. Most of them just have a passion. Some of them back into their startup by accident. But what they do is experiments. They try and they fail and they try and they fail and they try and they fail. And the thing to keep in mind, of course, is there is a limited runway here, right? In the real world, startups have a certain amount of money. And so you have to be able to do these experiments very, very quickly. Otherwise, you're going to run out of money before you find the answer, right? So when I say trial and error, when I say experiments, I don't mean blindly guessing. I don't mean randomly feeling your way around and try this and try that. You do have to be a little more thoughtful about it, but you have to understand it's still an experiment. Now, the expression for this that you often hear is something called fail fast. I'm not a huge fan of the word fail, so my preferred way of phrasing this is that's why speed wins, which is item number 2. So speed wins. So I used to work at TripAdvisor, and my first week at the company, the co-founder of the company, Steve Kaufer, invited all the new hires at the time to meet him for lunch. I was running late, because I'm always running late, and I had no idea where his office was. So I was running around and trying to find the door to his office. Finally, somebody pointed me in the corner, and I ran over in the corner, and on that door was a single piece of paper, and just handwritten on it, there were just 2 words, and it said, "Speed wins." And this was the core philosophy behind just about everything TripAdvisor did. It was this belief that doing things faster is how you win. Now, there's a few exceptions. You have to take your time with things like revenue numbers and user privacy. But other than that, if you go faster, you will beat anyone that is going slower. Now, that sounds obvious in a sense, but here's the slightly more subtle way to put it. There's this thing called Boyd's Law. And the argument here is that the speed of iteration, how quickly you can go, is much more important than the quality of each of those iterations. Now this, a lot of people will dispute. They say, what do you mean, quality? Are you saying cut corners? Are you saying do crappy things? How can building something faster possibly be better than building something of high quality? So where this law comes from is there's a colonel in the Air Force, John Boyd, and he was looking at this interesting incident where there was 2 jet fighters. These are World War I airplanes. I couldn't find a good picture of jet fighters, but there were 2 jet fighters, a US jet fighter and a Russian jet fighter. And the Russian fighter plane was superior in just about every way. It was faster, had better weapons, it could turn, had a tighter turning radius, it could climb a lot faster. In just about every way, it was better than the American jet fighter. And yet, when they had a dogfight, the US jet fighter would win 9 times out of 10. Why? The reason was that the US jet fighter had one advantage. The flight controls in that jet fighter were hydraulic, whereas in the Russian plane, they were manual, which meant that every little action that the pilot took was a little easier and a little quicker for the US jet fighter, whereas the Russian pilot had to kind of manually force the plane to turn and go up and down. And over the course of a fight, this would add up. The US plane would just turn just a little faster and a little easier. The Russian plane, even though generally the plane could outrun it and outgun it, just had trouble keeping up because each of those 1,000 little decisions, each of those 1,000 little maneuvers, the ability for the US pilot to do them just a little faster was all it took for that plane to win 9 dogfights out of 10. And it turns out the same law, this Boyd's Law of iteration, it applies to product development, it applies to coding, it applies to many, many aspects of life. So let's look at product development. The naive view of product development looks something like this. You start in the bottom left corner with an idea. I don't know if you guys can read that from the back. And you invest some time, and gradually the project becomes better, and the product develops, and you come up with a proof of concept, and you invest more time, and eventually you have this mature, stable, successful product. Now, anyone that's built a product knows it doesn't look anything like that. It does not work like that at all. Real product development looks a little more like that. You come up with an idea, you invest some amount of time, you get to a proof of concept that you show to real users, and it doesn't work. Something about it doesn't work, they don't like it, they don't use it, they don't want to pay for it. You go back to the drawing board, you try again. You come up with another proof of concept, it still doesn't work. You go back to the drawing board, you try again. That is actually where you spend the majority of your time developing products. It's going back and forth. It's trial and error. It's trial and error. It's trial and error. It's not necessarily blind trial and error. Again, there is thought, and you should think strategically about it. But at the end of the day, the problems that we're solving, the designs, the products, the companies, these are not easy problems. These are things that you're not going to just divine, come up with a solution to. The only way to find them is to do these experiments. That's the key. And so it turns out, if we're spending all of our time doing trial and error, then the company that gets to those errors the fastest is the one that's going to win. That's what speed wins means. It's actually finding errors faster than everyone else. And the successful startups that I've seen, that I've talked to, that I've worked at, they're really good at finding things that don't work as quickly as humanly possible. And it turns out there's actually methodologies that are trying to capture this. So the lean and agile movement, that's what they're about. They're about finding errors as early as possible. So if we take a look at this hypothetical chart with no numbers on it, so take it with a grain of salt, but the line on top, the green one, that's lean or agile, hypothetically, and the bottom one is this waterfall methodology. So waterfall, the basic idea there is you're going to do all your planning and you're going to do all your coding, you're going to do all of these things up front before ever launching the product to a single actual user. Lean and Agile says, no, do the absolute minimum you possibly can and get that product in front of users as quickly as possible. Now, if this was some weird idealized world where you had infinite time and budget, it wouldn't really matter which approach you took. At the end of the day, it would take you some amount of time to build the mature and stable product, and they would both end up at the same place. But in the real world, when you get to those users, when you put that product in front of them, you find out something doesn't work. Maybe the whole product doesn't work, maybe you have to pivot, maybe just some particular part of it needs to be changed, but you're going to have to go back to the drawing board and try again. And here's the key. This is time on the x-axis. Notice how much earlier in the process the lean and agile thing finds that error. This difference here, that difference right there, that is what you're looking for. That's what makes a company successful. It's finding that problem way earlier in the cycle. And then you get to try again, and then you find another problem, and you try again, and you find another problem. And by the time the waterfall folks have released their first iteration, because they want it to be really high quality, right? It's not like they're idiots. They're actually just trying to build something really nice. But by the time they built something and get it in front of users, you've already had a whole bunch of experiments, and you're probably well on your way to building something that's actually going to work. Whereas they are going to have to go to the drawing board and go through that whole gigantic process again. So that's the key. That's the key idea behind lean and agile, is that some of your assumptions, something that you think you know about your product, are wrong. Because we're not superhuman, right? None of us can predict that this product will work. We have ideas, we have hopes, but we don't know. The problem is you also don't know which of those assumptions are wrong. And that's where that experimentation comes in. So in the Startup Owner's Manual, what they discuss is that the winners, the successful startups in the world, they realize that a startup vision, your idea for the company, your idea for a product, it is just an untested hypothesis. And to see if it works or not, you need customer proof. And what I mean by customer proof is that it's you put it in front of a user as quickly as you possibly can, and then you try to find out, does this work? Is this what people want? So we can turn this into a bit of a recipe, what I'll call the speed wins recipe. And it goes like this. The first step that you do when building anything is to figure out what is your riskiest, most central assumption. What is the thing that if we got it wrong, the product or the business would fail? You then identify the absolute smallest experiment you can to test that assumption. And then most importantly, you repeat this over and over again. Now the reason I put this first is this might sound familiar to some of you. This is what some people refer to as the minimal viable product, MVP. This is the most misunderstood phrase, I think, in the, well, maybe not the English language, the startup language, is what is a minimal viable product? Because what most people do is they hear minimal and product, and they assume that what they're trying to do is just take whatever your product idea was, chop out half the ideas, and that's my MVP. I did it faster, right? That counts. But that's not a minimal viable product. That's a minimal product. Really, that's a half product. That's all that is. And that's not really how it works. I'm so passionate about this, and it frustrates me so much, I wrote a whole blog post about it, where minimal viable product, it's a process. It isn't a product at all. It is a process. It's a way of thinking. And so let's go through an example of this. Imagine that your startup idea is to launch, to help restaurants launch mobile apps. You think everyone wants to use mobile, everyone's got a mobile device. That local restaurant owner, he wants to have a mobile app for his restaurant so people can find him and look up menus and schedule and things like that. That's your idea. You're going to go build this giant platform to build mobile apps for restaurant owners. And you think to yourself, well, a minimal viable product, that's just a minimal product. So what you do is you say, okay, well, instead of building the whole platform, I'll chop out these features, and instead of taking a year to build that platform, I'm going to only take 6 months. And I'd put down a lot of money that you're going to fail, because that's not a minimal viable product. That's just a half of a product. So here's a better way to think about it. What's the riskiest assumption with that restaurant idea, with that mobile app idea? The riskiest assumption is that restaurant owners care about mobile apps and would pay for them. That's your single riskiest assumption. If that's wrong, your whole company is done. So how do you test it? What's the minimal experiment you can come up with to test that idea? It's not to build this giant platform or half of a platform. The minimal experiment is to go and talk to them. Your MVP, your first iteration, could be a napkin sketch of what you had in mind for these mobile apps. Or maybe you pay a designer and you spend a few bucks and a few dollars and you come up with a really basic wireframe, like use Balsamiq, use something like that. And go talk to some of your favorite restaurants in your local neighborhood. Tell them you love the restaurant and ask them, do you want a mobile app? Is this something you care about? Is this something you pay for? Is this a problem you experience? Now what you might find out is they would say, no, I don't want a mobile app, what are you talking about? And that's awesome, because what you just did is you just saved yourself 6 or 12 months of building the wrong thing at the cost of a day or two of talking to people. Your MVP, your little napkin sketch, just saved you 6 months. Or they might tell you something like this, which is, I don't want a mobile app, but I'd like a website. I want to turn up in Google, so when people look for Indian food in Dublin, my restaurant comes up at the top. Now your MVP, in a couple days, has completely pivoted your whole company rather than spending 6 months. So what do you do now? Do you now go build this giant website generating platform? Do you spend 6 months on that? No, you repeat the process again. So what's your riskiest assumption now? Now your riskiest assumption is that website owners would pay money for a website. So how do you test that assumption? What I would do is I would go online and I'd look up templates. There's tons and tons of free templates online. I would grab one that looks reasonably good for a website and I would by hand fill it in for one specific restaurant or two in my neighborhood. So I create their website, not a whole platform for creating them. There's no billing, nothing. Just a static website that I build in a day or two. If you have to learn HTML, it might take you a week or two. Now I go back and I talk to those website owners and I say, hey, if I could launch this thing for you tomorrow, would you give me 50 bucks? Now the answer might be no. And again, you just saved yourself 6 or 12 months of building the wrong thing in a day or maybe a week or two of work. Or the answer might be, yeah, of course, and here's 50 bucks. And now you have a paying customer right up front. And that is the best validation you can possibly have of your ideas. And you're going to repeat that process again and again. That's what I mean by MVP. That's what successful startups do. They do not go lock themselves in a room for months at a time on some hypothesis and only test it years later. They try to get those assumptions out into the open in front of real people as soon as humanly possible. And the thing to remember again is it still has to be viable. Right? You can't do an MVP by just throwing a napkin sketch and walking away. That's not going to work in all cases. It still has to be viable. And what viable means is it actually gives the user something of value. Right? So building that static website for 2 restaurants, for those 2 restaurants, that gave them something valuable, even though it's not your full idea. And I think this image does a lovely job of capturing the difference between viable and not viable MVPs. The one on the top, that's the half product, right? You want to build a car, so you start by building a wheel. That's not viable. That is not valuable or do anything useful for anyone. But if you start with a skateboard, or you start with a static website or a paper napkin sketch, that actually could be viable. So keep that one in mind. Okay, next item is data. So one of the things we've talked about quite a bit is that some of the assumptions you have about how to build a product or what the product should be or what your company should be, they're going to be wrong. They just are. No one is smart enough. Everyone makes tons and tons of mistakes. And you're going to have to do experiments to figure out which of those are wrong and what the right ones are. But the important thing about experiments, if you ask any scientist, is they gather data. You need to gather data. You need to measure things to know how you're doing. And most of the successful companies that I've seen are really obsessed with data. They try to gather as much data, measure as much as they possibly can. There's a great book called How to Measure Anything. And one of the laws, so to speak, from that book is that basically anything that you could measure, it's going to be superior to not measuring it at all. And as the book title implies, you can measure almost anything. And what is measurement? So this is a really important concept. A lot of people, when I say you should gather data, you should gather metrics, you should be data-driven, they assume that what I'm saying is you have to build these giant data sets and everything has to be incredibly statistically significant, and either you have completely the perfect mathematical answer or you have nothing. That's not really what a measurement is. A measurement is defined in this book, and I think it's well worth reading. A measurement is anything that reduces your uncertainty about a decision. And that's a really important decision. It's something that reduces your uncertainty, right? You come to face a new problem. How do I build a product to do X? And when you start out, your uncertainty is basically 100%. You don't know anything about the problem at all, and so you're completely uncertain. As you gather data, and especially effective data measurements, the uncertainty reduces very quickly. Probably not you never get to a case where you're completely certain about something, but reducing uncertainty is incredibly valuable, and data is a great way to do that. So some examples from LinkedIn. LinkedIn was obsessed with gathering data. We measured just about everything we could. We had a whole internal platform called Ingraphs, which measured all of our server metrics, all of our client metrics. How long did the database take? How long did the website take? How does it compare to the same time last week, last month, last quarter? That's all valuable data, right? When you have a bug or you have an outage, seeing the like this week versus last week overlaid reduces your uncertainty about whether the cause was, in this case, the database or not. We gathered tons of data about users. You probably can't read that from back there, but over here, there's data about what jobs they do, what industries they work in, what companies they work for. And on the right, we also tracked when users are using our site. And that's actually a really interesting thing that reduces uncertainty. So what we found was that the website was mostly used during work hours, 9 to 5. That's probably people looking up somebody's profile when they're going to interview them, or some salesperson before a call looking somebody up. That's when people were using the website. The mobile app was used much more at night. This was probably people coming home at night and messaging their contacts and doing a completely different set of activities. And so by measuring this, we can actually change what those products are and what they do just because we've gathered that data. That is a little piece of insight that, had we not measured it, we wouldn't have known. Fixed. How long do our tests take? How long does our build take? Is the way we're building our infrastructure supporting the scale of this company? You can guess, or you can measure it. And one of the things that's really, really powerful, and successful companies do this incredibly well, is this idea of feature toggles and A/B testing. And this is something that, if you're using data, is an incredibly powerful set of tools. So here's what it is. Anytime you're building a new feature, let's say there's going to be some new section on your homepage that's going to show up, you have the programmer wrap that entire feature in an if statement. That basically says, if this feature toggle is enabled, show the new feature. Otherwise, don't show it at all. And by default, all feature toggles are off, which means you can create the new feature, you can check it into the code, you can deploy it to the live site, no one will see it because it's off by default. Now that's actually really useful for a lot of reasons, especially as the company grows. That becomes valuable because now everyone can check into the same code base. You can deploy 100 times a day, and because the code is off, you're not breaking things 100 times a day. But it's actually a lot more powerful than that. So it's off by default, but you create some sort of user interface where you can turn it on. Your company employees can turn those features on selectively. So on the left side, this is a screenshot from a thing called Xlnt, X-L-N-T, at LinkedIn. And this was a way where we could basically segment our user base into different groups, into different buckets. Those buckets could be random, so 50% of users go in bucket A and 50% go in bucket B. Those buckets could be based on geography, so all users in North America are in this bucket, all users in Europe are in this bucket. Those could be things like all LinkedIn employees are in a certain bucket. So basically, we have some way of segmenting users. And the key was that using this user interface, within a couple minutes, we could turn on any of those features for any of those buckets. And that is incredibly powerful. So one thing you can do with that is to carefully ramp features up. So you launch the thing and it's off, and then the first thing you do, typically, is you turn it on just for employees of your company. So now all employees that are using your website can see the new feature, test it, give feedback, et cetera. If it's still working well, you now turn it on for, let's say, 1% of all of your users. And you see what happens. Maybe a ton of errors show up in your logs, and you shut the feature off. Maybe it's working well. Maybe your metrics, if you're measuring, take a nosedive, and you shut the feature off because it's doing something wrong. Maybe your metrics take off, and you continue to ramp the feature up to 10% of users, to 100% of users. This is how LinkedIn launches things. This is how Twitter launches things. This is how Facebook launches things. This is how Google launches things. They never just throw a thing out there and hope for the best. It's always wrapped with a feature toggle and very, very carefully ramped up. And the entire time you're ramping it, you're measuring. You're measuring what impact it has. And that's actually the last and maybe the most useful thing about feature toggles, is if you can partition your code base into separate groups, into separate buckets, not your code base, your user base, then you can see what impact new features are actually having. Because what most companies do, the ones that are not super successful, is this. This is the typical product development cycle. You have an idea, you spend some time building it, you release it, you have a party, we launched, and that's it. And then no one's there to pay attention to whether this thing actually worked. Was it successful? Did it do what you thought it should do? There's no answer to that. People are just kind of guessing. Yeah, my new redesign is amazing, except what you don't know is that half your users hate it and left. And so eventually, most product launches, if you actually follow them a year later, 5 years later, they're not successful. And most of them, you give up, you throw them away, you shut them off. If you have the ability to partition your users into random groups and turn features on for some of them and not for others, now you can do A/B testing or bucket testing if there's more than 2 buckets. And now your your development cycle looks like this. You come up with an idea, you develop that product, hopefully a minimal viable product, and now you release it, but you don't release it to everyone. You maybe release it to 50% of users, but not to the other 50%. And then you compare the metrics between those 2 groups. Do the people in group A who can see this feature behave differently? Do they use the site more? Do they click more ads? Do they buy more product? Or do they leave? Do they hate it? Are they confused? Are they seeing errors? Because what we're talking about here is a controlled experiment, right? This is all about experimentation. This is what scientists have done for ages and ages. Because you can compare these 2 groups and the only difference between them is whether the feature is on or off, you can have reasonably high confidence that this feature is or isn't having the impact that you want. If it is, great, success, ramp it up to 100% of users. If it's not, now you iterate. You go back to the drawing board, you repeat that process, you change something about it, you try again. You keep doing these experiments over and over again until either you're successful or you realize, you know what, this idea just isn't working and you give up on it and you throw it away and you shut off that feature toggle for everyone. That is how successful companies build products. They don't just throw things out there and see what sticks. They test and they measure. And so let me give you an example of this. This is, I don't know if you guys can see that. That might be a little too light. From something like 2011, this is LinkedIn's subscription page, where users sign up and basically pay LinkedIn more money to use certain premium features. And we had a design that we'd come up with for the site. And the only difference between the designs was we didn't know what stock photo to use at the top of the page. We wanted to have some successful business person, but we didn't know what that person should look like. So we could have just let a designer pick one out of a hat, but instead we did a bucket test. We divided users into 4 groups, A, B, C, D. And so to group A, in the top left, we showed, I guess, a young guy, group B, a young woman, group C, an old guy, et cetera. And then we just saw what was the impact. So I don't know how well you guys can see that, but who thinks group A performed best? Nobody. Group B? A few people. Group C? A few more people. And group D? A few more. Okay, so we had a pretty random scattering. The reality was group C performed significantly better. Much, much better. People signed up and paid the company more money because of this guy shaking hands, for some reason. It's sometimes hard to tell why. But that's pretty amazing, right? We measured something for a week, and now the company is more successful as a result.
Did you measure whether it was male or female?
Yeah, there was actually a more detailed breakdown. It was for most users that image worked the best, but for some percentage of users, I don't remember the detail, but there was 1 or 2 other images that worked a little better in some cases. But for the majority of users, the elderly guy was I'm going to subscribe now. I want to look like this guy, apparently.
Was the one that came on the subscription page or on the general page? Specifically when it came to signing the dark suit, or was it already at the beginning of it?
I think it was only the subscription page. Literally this page here where it's a little hard to see, but there's basically just buttons that say upgrade to Business, Business Plus, Pro. That page was the only one we changed. That was the only difference, and just changing that one guy on that one page made more money. Made a company more successful. Potentially these sorts of things, this is kind of like a small, simple example, of course, but these are the sorts of things that are difference between your company thinking subscriptions are a great idea or subscriptions aren't going to work, we should throw that business model away. It's measuring, it's testing, it's experimenting. Now, I do want to caution you, you don't want to go too crazy with data and measurements. There are some companies that basically say, humans do not matter, bring me data, and we will use only data and nothing else ever. I think you can take it too far. Data should be used to inform your decision-making process. It should be used to reduce your uncertainty. But no data is perfect. Nothing can ever completely eliminate uncertainty. And so you still need human judgment in the process. And that's actually a good way to figure out what you should and shouldn't measure. Because it takes some amount of resources, some amount of time to set up measurement. So you need to think about what is valuable to measure. And one of the ways to figure that out is, before measuring something, ask, if I had certain data back from this measurement, would it change my decision making? If it's not going to have any impact on what decisions you make, what products you're going to build, or how you're going to build them, don't measure it. It's not a valuable metric. Okay, distribution. So a lot of people have heard this lovely phrase, if you build it, they will come. And people that have built products and companies know that it's a complete lie. Products do not sell themselves. And the reality is, the successful companies in the world build distribution into their product. It is an inherent part of their strategy. It's not something you add later. It's not like, I'm going to go build this product, and I'm going to sprinkle a little marketing sauce on later. That just doesn't work. The distribution, the way you get your product out to people so they know about it, so that they can find it, so that they can buy it, so they can tell their friends about it, has to be a part of the product. And if it's not, even the best product will not save you. And there's plenty of examples of this. Here's just two, where the really wonderful, beloved products were still failures because they lost from a distribution perspective. One was TiVo, which was the first DVR. It came out, all of a sudden you could record TV, you could pause TV, you could rewind TV. This was incredible. People loved TiVo, thought it was the greatest thing ever. The people that used it absolutely adored the product, always, for all of its history. It was never a very successful company, and the reason for that is, a little while after they came out, well, first of all, they didn't do a very good job marketing it, so that's also part of distribution. But even after that, cable companies came out and said, oh, all right, well, here's a crappy DVR, but it comes with your cable subscription. And TiVo, no matter how good the product was, could never overcome that sort of distribution channel. They just couldn't compete with that. Same sort of thing happened to Netscape. When Netscape was out and the first versions of Internet Explorer came out, Netscape was a vastly better browser, much, much better web browser. Didn't matter. Internet Explorer shipped with Windows, and Netscape did not. And that distribution channel was enough for Internet Explorer to completely destroy Netscape. Now, that's not the only reasons these companies failed. It's never quite that simple, but distribution matters. Even if your product is incredible, you still need to get distribution right to be successful. And one of the first questions you may want to ask as you're thinking of building a product and as you're thinking about how you're going to distribute it and market it is, how many customers do you need for your business to be a success? And it turns out that this number, the number of customers, has a pretty profound impact on how you do distribution. So that's why it's a good first question. So as an example, let's say your goal was to build a company that makes $1 billion in revenue. Now, to do that, it depends on how much your products cost. So for example, if you're Coca-Cola and you sell cans of soda for about $1, then to make $1 billion, you're going to need to reach about 1 billion customers. In fact, you'll have to reach quite a bit more, because not 100% of them will buy, but some will be recurring. So we'll just go with 1 billion. If you build laptops for $1,000, now you're going to have to reach about 1 million customers. And if you sell high-end mortgages for $1 million each, you need about 1,000 customers. And this is a really critical deciding factor, this number of customers. Because, well, think about it. To reach 1 billion customers, or somewhere in that range, the only options you have are things like mass advertising. You can't hire a sales team to sell to 1 billion people. That's just not going to work. You have to do mass advertising. Whereas if you're, let's say, Oracle, and you're selling enterprise software for $100,000 a pop, advertising is not useful for you. No one is going to go see an ad, click it, and swipe a credit card for a $100,000 purchase. No one does that. You need a sales team, right? And so the number of customers, that is step one to understanding which distribution strategy is going to work for your company. So here's a list of a few of the common distribution strategies. This is definitely not a complete list. I just bring it up because I've run across many, many startups who have great, great products, and they just haven't thought through this at all. They haven't thought at all about how they're going to distribute things. And what you'll find is that the really successful companies, when you ask them how it works, they will tell you. They will tell you exactly how their distribution works. It is a core part of their DNA. That's what makes them successful. So here's a few examples. So advertising. This is the most common one that everyone thinks of, but it doesn't actually work for everyone. It will work for something like Coca-Cola, and so there's an example, Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola. And it's things like print ads, online ads, newspaper ads, billboards, these advertising platforms. Now the cool thing about them is the more you spend, the more people you're going to reach. So you can reach a pretty awe-inspiring audience with advertising, and that's what Coca-Cola does. The problem is it's really expensive. So for startups, this isn't always a good strategy to use. You just don't have the cash for it. And also, you're battling for attention. I mean, look at this crazy thing. There's like 300 logos hitting you in the face at the same time. And there's some people online are starting to become blind to ads. They're starting to use ad block. They're starting to use DVR, like TiVo, to skip ads completely. So this is a mixed bag. It can work very well, but it's definitely not the solution for everyone. And one of the other problems, especially with some of the traditional advertising, so like print ads, and newspaper ads, billboards, is you don't even know if it's working or not. That whole measurement and data thing is actually very hard to do with traditional advertising. With online ads, you sometimes can, because you can measure click-through rates, but you don't know if somebody saw your ad and then a week later was influenced. That's hard to measure. And there's a famous quote from John Wanamaker where he says that half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is, I don't know which half. So 2, traditional media. This is things like newspapers end up on TV, magazines talk about you, radio talks about you. Similar to advertising, this can have massive reach. Probably not as far as ads, because with ads, the more you spend, the more people you reach, but publications like New York Times and Forbes reach millions and millions of people. But there's a few downsides to PR. One of those is that it doesn't last very long. So the article comes out, you get a big spike in traffic. A week later, no one's really reading the article anymore, and traffic goes right back to where it used to be. So it's not a very sustainable marketing strategy, but it can be nice. It can be a good way to kick things off. And if you build a really good relationship with the media, you can get PR hits over and over again and build a lot of good distribution from that. The catch is that it can be positive or negative. So I took a bunch of the positive articles about LinkedIn, but believe me, as I'm sure you all know, there are many, many negative ones, and you can't really control it. So media can be a double-edged sword. Social media is a very interesting one. There's a lot of startups that basically you ask them what's their distribution strategy, and they just say, I'm going to go viral. Or they say, I'm going to use viral marketing. I'm going to growth hack my way. What? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So you can use tools like email, Twitter, Facebook, et cetera. You can use those very, very effectively. But most companies don't really understand how those things work. They just assume that if I just post something into the feed, somehow magical traffic will appear. And that's just not quite how it works. So first of all, how far you reach with these things depends on the size of your audience. If you don't have any Twitter followers, doesn't really matter. You're not going to reach anyone. If you don't have a giant email list, you're not going to reach everyone. But even if you do, the wrong way to use these, especially email, and I think with email people get this very wrong, is you don't want to just spam people. If you're just sending these big marketing bombs that say, I built a new product, look at me, it's going to look like advertising. It's going to fail. The click-through rates are going to be 0.00001. The way to do email marketing and the way to do a lot of this social media stuff is you know who the person is, and so you can personalize the content to them. And if you're building a product that is social in nature, really keep this in mind, because the successful companies are amazing at this. So as an example, Facebook has this awesome email that anytime someone tags you in a photo, it sends you an email that says, hey, come back to the Facebook site. Somebody just tagged you in a photo. Now, I don't know about you guys, but my click-through rate on that is 100%. There's never been one of those that I did not click, because I want to make sure I'm not in some horrible, embarrassing photo that I'm going to regret. But that's important, right? This is incredibly powerful. This is distribution. This is marketing. This is how Facebook grew the way it did, is because the content they sent wasn't just, hey, look at our new Photos app. It was, hey, we have a photo of you. And that's a big deal. Now, I hesitate to show the next one, because LinkedIn has had many fails with email marketing. They do it the wrong way in a lot of cases. Don't blame me. I have nothing to do with that. But occasionally, they get it really, really right. So LinkedIn, for example, had this email campaign called Year in Review. I'm not sure if they still do it. But once a year, they would send out an email that says, hey, in the last year, these are all of your contacts who got new jobs or changed careers or got promoted. And it was just this big block of faces. And this thing was incredible, right? Because you would go on there and you would see people you know, and you'd be really curious. Where did that guy or that girl go to? What job did they get? What promotion did they get? And the click-through rate on that, people would click multiple times on the same email. So the click-through rate was off the charts. So this is how you can do email marketing. It needs to be personalized. If you're building a product that's inherently social, personalize it. Focus on the person, not just announcing your products and dumping things in the stream. That just doesn't work very well. Social media does give you the potential to go viral. And by viral, what I mean is that your users share your product with other users, who then share your product with other users, who then share your product with other users, et cetera. You have things like Gangnam Style, which has almost 3 billion views, which is kind of incredible. And it's not like they did some giant advertising campaign for this. This was people sharing it with their friends, sharing it with their friends, sharing it with their friends. Now, the problem with virality is it's unpredictable. There is no one in the world who could tell you with any certainty that something is or isn't going to go viral. So as a marketing strategy, just assuming that you're going to build a funny video and put it out there and everyone's going to share it and tweet about it isn't very effective. It's very, very hard to predict when that'll happen. So the way that you can actually build viral growth is it has to be a part of your product. And that doesn't work for all products. If your product isn't inherently social, if people aren't inherently interacting with other people in your product, viral growth is probably not going to work for you. So let me give an example of where it does work. So you have a social network like LinkedIn, and a viral loop that's very consciously built into the product is somebody sends you a connection request, so you get an email. You click accept or decline, which takes you to the LinkedIn website, and you land on this page. This is the people you may know page. Now on here, you can accept or decline the invite, but we also show you the faces of a bunch of other people who you might know. So now you land here, and now you invite a couple more people. Now they get emails, they click on those emails, they end up back on this page, and the loop continues, and it's users bringing in users, bringing in users. This isn't advertising, so you're not paying for it, but it's a part of your product. Somebody had to build this flow, optimize this flow. I can't tell you how much A/B testing went into making this effective, and a huge, astonishingly high percentage of LinkedIn's growth and the fact that it exists and is successful as a company came from building this flow correctly. So if you're building a social product, this is what you need to think about. It's not just put up a funny video with cats in it and you're going to be viral. That's not really how it works. Inbound marketing. The idea here with inbound marketing is instead of picking up a megaphone and shouting at people like you do with advertising, with inbound marketing, you create some sort of like a honeypot, something that attracts users. Usually that's going to be valuable content. That might be a blog post, that might be a video, that might be a talk. The point is you are teaching people something, you are giving them something of value that brings them to your product. Not because they're trying to buy a product, not because they even know who you are, but because you produce some kind of valuable content that they just happen to be interested in. Now, once they're on your website, on your blog, on your video, now you can figure out a way to convert them into a paying customer. But this is how you attract them. Inbound marketing is very powerful. What's nice about it is startups can't compete with big companies in terms of ad budgets, right? Just, you don't have that kind of money. But you can produce very good quality content. And quality content can attract a lot of users. And many companies have been built around this strategy almost exclusively. You do a Google search for something and this company's content comes up, you click on it, you see it a few times, you eventually realize this company is the expert in whatever that topic is. The reach isn't quite as high as advertising usually, but the conversion rate can be really high and the cost is really low. So for startups, this one's pretty powerful. SEO, that's search engine optimization. So, I don't know if you guys know this, Google handles 2 trillion search queries every year. Trillion. It only takes a tiny, tiny little slice of that to build a pretty astonishingly large business. So there are some startups that are masters of search engine optimization. TripAdvisor is actually one of them. If you Google almost any term, I don't know if you can see that from back there, but I searched for Dublin hotels, TripAdvisor is going to be one of the top 3 results for almost any query that involves hotels, for most tourism queries, for restaurant queries. They're going to come up at the top in most cases. And to make that happen, though, you need a lot of user-generated content. Sometimes you can do it with inbound marketing. The two kind of work together. But usually, you need an astonishing amount of content to drive a huge business off of SEO. So TripAdvisor has that. They have 500 million reviews on the site. But if you're thinking about SEO, you have to think about how am I going to generate a lot of high quality content and get a lot of people to link to it. And then finally, sales. As I mentioned, for expensive products, no one's going to swipe a credit card for a $100,000 piece of software. You're going to have a sales team. There's inside sales. These are folks that sit in your office or in your store, and they sell to a large number of customers from wherever they are. And then there's outside sales, which is where the salesperson goes to the customer site. Generally, sales has a very short reach, right? It's not very scalable. It's one salesperson per deal or sometimes per a few deals. But if you have an expensive product, sometimes there's just no other option. And this is the only way you can do it. And so if you look at a lot of successful companies that have pricey products, they think a lot about how to do sales and do it very well. Okay, final thing, I'm going a little over time, apologize for that, is sharing. So the one other thing that I've noticed about most of these successful companies is they're remarkably open. They share just about everything they do. As an example, they produce tons and tons of papers. So Google published a paper on MapReduce, which is one of the core ideas behind how Google search used to work. There's tons of open source. So LinkedIn released a thing called Kafka, but there's something like 20 million repositories on GitHub now with open source code. They release hardware. Facebook started this Open Compute project where they talk about how to build efficient data centers. There's entire companies that are purely open source. Mozilla, you can look up their meeting minutes are available public. Their code is available publicly. They release everything to the public. Why? Why are Silicon Valley companies, why are these successful companies so open, right? As opposed to like Wall Street or something like that where people are super secretive and they won't tell you anything. There's a few reasons. One of them is quality. So when is your home, your house, your apartment, when do you make it the absolute cleanest?
When mom's coming to visit.
When someone is coming to visit, exactly. When you know somebody else is looking, you do a better job. When you know someone else is looking at your code, you're going to write better code, you're going to write more tests, more documentation. When you know somebody else is going to watch your presentation, you put in a few extra hours to do a good job at it. So just by releasing your code, just by sharing what you do, you get better work. Another one is you get free work, you get free labor. So anytime this is especially for open source software, a lot of people ask, why would you give away this code that you spent months and years working on? Well, the reason is that a company can usually afford to throw a few people at a given project, but the open source community can throw hundreds or thousands. Ruby on Rails, which is one of the most popular open source projects, was released by a small little company called Basecamp. And that project now has something like 3,000 different programmers who have contributed to it. That company could have never hired 3,000 people in its entire existence to work on this project, but by releasing it, now there's 3,000 people contributing bug fixes, contributing documentation improvements, contributing bug reports, etc. So you release things and all of a sudden you benefit from the community. Happiness is another big one. I don't know about you, but if I've worked on something for a long time, if it's proprietary and then I have to leave the company, it's a little depressing, right? You lose access. You put all this time, all this sweat and tears into something, and you decide to change jobs, and now you'll never see that thing again. You'll never get to work on that code or that project or whatever it is. That sucks. One of the wonderful things about allowing people to share what they do, especially open source, but give talks about all of that, is it stays with you for the rest of your career. The code that I've open sourced at a company 10 years ago, I can still access it today. I could contribute to it today. That's the free labor. I can show it on my resume for the rest of my career. So it makes people really happy, actually. I'm much more motivated working on open source than anything proprietary. Branding. If you think for a second of what you think are the best software companies in the entire world, a few names will pop into your head, and only a few names. Now, the reason those names pop into your head is partially they do good work, that's true, but also they tell you about it all the time. Any company you think is great, I guarantee you they've shared tons of stuff. You've read their blog posts, maybe their papers, maybe you've used their code, you've used their products, you've seen their talks, you've seen them at every conference. This is how you build a brand as a company. It's you share what you've done and what you've learned. That's how you become seen as an expert in everyone's eyes. And then the final one is mastery. The best way to learn something is to teach it. So by having people share at your company what they do and share just about everything, they actually end up better. It's like a training program, except you don't have to spend anything on it. You just give them the time to do what they want to do anyway. And so that's why I'm here today. That's why I'm sharing this stuff with you. I'm sharing what I've learned. Hopefully I'll become a little smarter as a result. If you guys want to learn more, check out the book, Hello Startup. Thank you very much.